It's not about male or female, it's about listening to what the client wants. That's what it says in the policy, brilliant, until you actually come to invoke it, in which case often people will say, well, our budget's not there. Women weren't really considered, it was just get on with the job.
I'm with Caroline Neal, who is Security and Risk Management Consultant. What we're talking about today is how we can make it safer for female travellers, especially in high risk or fragile environments, and what measures security and risk management leaders can take to put the right policies and procedures in place. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you, delighted to be here.
So tell me a little bit about your background.
So I started my career in the military. I served for about 10 years in the regular service and then a couple of years in the reservists. And then once I left the military, so for the last 24, 25 years, I've been working in conflict-affected state and just fragile environments. As a security and risk management consultant and trainer.
Can you tell me a little bit about some of the key things that stand out for you for when females are operating in such difficult environments? What are the key things that tend to get missed off in their policies and procedures that could help keep them safe?
I think a lot of security professionals working in-house with big organisations often generally tend to be men. There's a little bit of a gap in the market really, because a lot of the male security advisors, they don't necessarily talk to the female staff. And so sort of top tip to you out there who are male security advisors, talk to your female staff, find out what their issues are, what their concerns are, because everybody's an individual. And I think often organisations, they write a fantastic policy and procedures, but they don't talk to the people who it affects. So therefore, they might be a little bit wide of the mark. When I first started my career, women weren't really considered. It was just get on with the job, and it doesn't matter whether there were locks on your doors when you're out in the field. Whereas I think now there's much more thought given to female security, working particularly in the field or when we're working overseas in difficult locations.
Yeah. What questions do you think they should be asking their female counterparts and employees just to build that awareness of what actually matters to them?
I think some of it's around the travel, how they're going to get to the place, what security is in place when they're there. Are they in a villa or a hotel, or are they in the field in a container-built environment in the middle of the desert? And then I think asking them what would make them feel safer. So a really good example was I was working for an oil and gas company, and we were running some training in the field in the middle of the desert, and none of the doors had locks on them for safety reasons, because if there was a problem, people had to be able to get out. But the flip side of that was that they had two females working with 100 guys of all different nationalities on a camp. And the women felt unsafe because anybody could walk into their room while they were sleeping. So we sort of came up with a halfway house of using door chocks and a temporary measure to overcome the health and safety side of it. That meant they could still get out and somebody could get in, but it would stop people just inadvertently walking into their rooms.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point when you're sort of battling between the policies and the procedures.
Absolutely, yeah, because the health and safety did take priority, absolutely, but you also had to take into consideration that the women didn't feel safe. And I understood that, and we sort of worked together with the health and safety professionals to make sure we could come up with a solution that worked for them and was acceptable to the women.
Is there any other examples you can think of that maybe the risk being overridden that could compromise the safety of some of the female travellers?
I think certainly the policies will say you don't want to be arriving in a conflict area or a conflict affected area at night, for example. So if you're particularly a lone female traveller, you arrive in an airport where all the staff are all males, and you come out as a woman of a different colour skin, 2 a.m. It's not great when all the taxi drivers are all male as well. Where by just coming in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it means you're in daylight, there's more people around, you feel slightly safer. But of course, that's what it says in the policy, brilliant, until you actually come to invoke it, and it's $200, £200, €200 more expensive to fly in the afternoon, in which case often people will say, well, our budget's not there. So you're then forced to almost counteract the policy, which says it is important to stay safe as a staff member or as a female staff member. Even male members of staff, it's not great to be arriving at 2 o'clock in the morning in a strange country. But I think it's even more important if you're a lone female, because you're more of a target and you stand out more.
Organisations wouldn't want to be putting special measures in place like that for females, but it's something that probably should be highlighted more and considered, because it might not always be as obvious to people. Any advice that you can think of over the years that you've heard that maybe doesn't ring as true, that tends to be assumed to be standard practice?
I think probably the one that makes me giggle the most is the wedding ring. So I've seen it in a lot of security procedure documents where we advise you to, if you're a female, to wear a wedding ring in the Middle East particularly, or North Africa. And I can honestly say I tried it because I sort of thought, well, maybe it's the point, and I don't wear a wedding ring. So I tried it, and it didn't make any difference to the harassment that I was experiencing from taxi drivers or hotel staff, or even some of the local staff I was working with. So I take that with a pinch of salt, and I always giggle about that one when I see it in a policy, because it's not really great advice. Looking at your safety and security in terms of the when you arrive and your hotels and how you move around is much more important than whether I have a wedding ring on or not.
Is there anything that you've noticed over the years from working in such complex places that you have found can be a hindrance rather than a help when they're putting security measures in place with close protection officers or people on the ground to protect them?
Whoever you're putting security in place for, I think it's really important to talk to those people and really listen to what they're saying. Particularly if you're putting in security for higher risk places, I think it's important that you consider the fears of the staff. So I think it's not about male or female, it's about listening to what the client wants and the job that the client is trying to do, and then trying to make sure that the appropriate security is in place. It might be protective security rather than a close protection that's required, to give them a little bit more flexibility in the way that they move around.
And it sounds like adaptability and taking the steps to communicate beforehand is what makes the difference. Is there anything that you would say has worked particularly well?
When people are being protected by close protection teams, I think it's quite important that the team make the client feel part of the process. I've worked as a close protection officer, and I've also been protected going in and out of Baghdad by various security companies, and I've always been very impressed by those who actually include me in the briefing and ask me questions. And when I say, well, could you just show us where the radio is, because if anything happens to you, I might have to use the radio myself to call for help. And can we show all of the rest of us who are being protected how to work it? And those have taken the time, rather than rush, and you don't need to know that. It's never been a great answer in my view, because if you're protecting someone, we're there to be protected. So it was quite interesting being on the other side as a client, and the way that security professionals dealt with me, not knowing that I actually was a security professional. They thought I was the client. So it can be quite interesting. I always recommend people to go and be a client and then see what it feels like.
I suppose you can put all the policies in place in the world, but actually when you're on the ground, understanding what kind of falls by the wayside in a crisis is really interesting.
Yeah. And it's sometimes about interpersonal skills with the client as well, and I think it's really important that you just talk to them gently, talk to your client in a gentle way, let them know that you're there. If they have any concerns, they can talk to you. And then that way you can find solutions together. It's a sort of all-embracing solution rather than telling them what to do. And I don't think anybody likes that.
Empathy, or just being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, is that something that you feel that you can train people, or they can learn over time?
I think you can train people to look at being in the other person's shoes. Empathy, I'm not sure, I don't know how well you can train that, because if you don't have that inherent interest in other people's feelings, or the way that they are scared in a hostile environment or in a conflict zone or post-conflict zone, if you don't understand that fear, then it's very difficult to reassure them that you can put measures in place to help them. It's much better to have that conversation, leave a little bit more time before you have to protect them or deal with their security, and talk to them about what their fears are, and then you can allay those fears and make them feel part of the decision-making process.
Caroline, thank you so much for your time today. It's been fantastic talking to you, and thank you for sharing your pearls of wisdom from the last 25 years. Thank you.